Mormon translation, rock in a hat, or Nephite interpreters. There seems to be a lot of confusion these days about how the Book of Mormon was really written. The LDS Church is floundering in its message on how it happened, now that President Nelson seems to have joined forces recently with the anti-Mormon influences in their description of how Joseph Smith revealed the book. Their theories blanket church sites, social media, and the web in a way that makes the actual history hard to find. In the middle of all this, it's difficult for the average reader of the Book of Mormon to know the truth. And so I've decided to do some research on my own on this subject and try to make some sense of it. In studying out the various scenarios, I've narrowed down the truth about the writing of the Book of Mormon to what I think are the four most likely possible scenarios. First, the President Nelson option, that the Book of Mormon was, quote, revealed to Joseph Smith while he looked at a rock or rocks in a hat. Second, the CES Letter option, that it was a fraudulent book that Joseph Smith dictated while looking at a rock in a hat. Third, the Joseph Smith option, that it was a true book that Joseph Smith translated directly from golden plates through two interpreter stones fastened into rims of a bow, which were given to him by an angel. And fourth, the Ghostwriter option, that an expert writer or team of writers wrote a fraudulent book and then staged the translation process in order to get it published. I'd like to talk about each of these scenarios, first looking at the evidence to back up their claims, and then looking at the potential flaws of each argument. So here we go. First, the President Nelson option. President Nelson now claims that the Book of Mormon was, quote, revealed to Joseph Smith while he looked into a hat at a rock or rocks that he found in the earth, much like someone looking at a smartphone. Here's a picture on LDS.org of what the LDS Church claims is Joseph's actual seer stone. And in a demonstration he did a couple of years ago when he became president of the LDS Church, Russell M. Nelson showed his new version of how the Book of Mormon was made.
Quite miraculous, really, through the gift and power of God. We have a lot of suggestions about how it was done. We know that they had a table like this. We know they had the golden plates covered usually, and Joseph used these the Urim and Thummim seer stones in the hat, and it was easier for him to see the light when he take that position. To me, it's like having my mobile phone at my hand, and I can get messages on it that you can't see.
So he thinks it was done by the gift and power of God, but now he claims it was done with the plates covered up, sitting in a corner, and Joseph looking at the stone or stones in a hat. In reading the LDS Church Gospel Topics essay on the subject, it's a little nebulous as to the sources of evidence they have for this scenario. But as I dig deeper, it seems like the idea for this rock in the hat method of translation came from three original sources. The first original source I can find for the idea behind President Nelson's rock in the hat scenario is a book entitled Mormonism Unveiled, which coincidentally was the first known anti-Mormon book to be published in America. It was written in 1834, about 6 years after the Book of Mormon translation, by a man named Eber Howe. Eber never knew Joseph Smith or joined the church in his lifetime, but he nevertheless decided to write an expose on the Mormon movement after his wife and other family members joined the church. In his expose, he accused Joseph Smith of such things as treasure digging and copying the Book of Mormon from the Spalding manuscript. And he's the first person known to suggest that Joseph used a stone in a hat to translate. However, because his book seems more like an attack piece and not based on first-hand knowledge or evidence, I'm not going to rely on it as a primary support for this option. The second known source for the Russell Nelson rock in the hat scenario is none other than Emma Smith, Joseph's wife. While there is no existing record of Emma ever making a statement about the translation process during the lifetimes of Joseph or Oliver Cowdery, she did talk about it when she was interviewed shortly before her death in 1877 by her son Joseph Smith III, then the leader of the RLDS Church. Notes for that interview were published a few months later after she had died. In it, she's claimed to have said, quote, "In writing for your father, I frequently wrote day after day, often sitting at the table close by him. He sitting with his face buried in his hat, with his stone in it, dictating hour after hour with nothing between us." Coming from the wife of the prophet, this statement carries a lot of weight. Emma lived in that same house as Joseph throughout the translation, and alludes in the interview to the small part of the translation she helped Joseph with before Oliver Cowdery arrived on the scene. Even though the interview was done 50 years after the translation, it's a powerful witness for the Rock in the Hat theory. The third and final source for Nelson's Rock in the Hat translation scenario comes from David Whitmer. David met Joseph soon after Joseph obtained the gold plates and was a huge logistical help to Joseph during the translation process. At times, he allowed Joseph to stay at his house and even provided Joseph and Oliver Cowdery a room in his house for the translation efforts. David Whitmer went on to become not only one of the first members of the church, but more importantly, he was one of the 3 men who saw an angel with the gold plates and who touched the plates and who heard the voice of the Lord tell them that the record was true. Even though David left the church a few years later in 1837, he remained true to his testimony of the divinity of the Book of Mormon until he died. In 1887, 50 years after he was excommunicated from the church, and almost 60 years after the Book of Mormon was translated, David published a pamphlet called An Address to All Believers in Christ. As I read this pamphlet, I found it very interesting and informative on a number of levels. It is a clarion call to members of the various LDS factions to come back to the truer belief in the Book of Mormon. Importantly, David never claims in the pamphlet to have been an eyewitness to the actual translation process, or to have been a part of the translation himself, but he does describe his opinion on the translation as follows. I will now give you a description of the manner in which the Book of Mormon was translated. Joseph Smith would put the seer stone into a hat, put his face in the hat, drawing it closely around his face to exclude the light, and in the darkness the spiritual light would shine. A piece of something resembling parchment would appear, and under it was an interpretation in English. Brother Joseph would read off the English to Oliver Cowdery, who was his principal scribe, and when it was written down and repeated to Brother Joseph to see if it was correct, then it would disappear, and another character with the interpretation would appear. Thus the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, and not by the power of any man. As someone who was in the same building when the translation was going on, and as one of the 3 witnesses to the Book of Mormon, this is an important proof of how the translation could have happened. So, using these 3 sources, Mormonism Unveiled, Emma's 1877 interview, and David Whitmer's 1887 publication, the modern LDS Church and its president, Russell Nelson, have concluded that the Book of Mormon was, quote, revealed by Joseph Smith through the gift and power of God, but by putting his head in a hat and reading from a seer stone or stones, and not from the gold plates themselves. Second, the CES scenario. This second likely scenario is the one espoused by Jeremy Runnels, the author of the now famous CES letter. Jeremy and most other prominent anti-Mormon influencers of today, such as John DeLynn, RFM, Bill Reel, also believe, like Russell Nelson, that the Book of Mormon was dictated by Joseph Smith as he looked at a seer stone in a hat. Except they believe the book is not true and is instead a fraud. This scenario is believed by many people who leave the church after reading the CES letter. In the letter, Jeremy says, unlike the story I've been taught in Sunday school, priesthood, general conferences, seminary, EFY, Ensigns, church history tour, missionary training center, and BYU, Joseph Smith used a rock and a hat for translating the Book of Mormon. In other words, Joseph used the same magic device or Ouija board that he used during his treasure hunting days. He put a rock, called a peepstone, in his hat and put his face in the hat, while the gold plates were covered, placed in another room, or even buried in the woods. The gold plates were not used for the Book of Mormon we have today. He then compares how the LDS Church used to claim the translation happened and how the LDS President Nelson now claims it happened. For his sources, Jeremy Runnels uses the same quotes by David Whitmer that the church uses, as well as statements by modern LDS leaders and even the gospel topic essay on the LDS.org. Basically, the CES letter bases its evidence for the Rock in the Hat theory on the words of the LDS Church, but with the twist that the Book of Mormon is not true. Jeremy's feelings of betrayal and deception at the hands of the LDS leaders are palpable in his letter and worthy of empathy. It's hard for him and many other members who read the CES letter to believe in the truthfulness and the divinity of a book that is a product of a church that they feel has done so many evil and deceptive things over 150 years. How could the Book of Mormon come from God when the LDS Church seems to be such a fraud? Third, the Joseph Smith scenario. This third likely scenario is that Joseph did just what he said he did. that he translated an actual ancient record written on golden plates by looking through two clear interpreter stones fastened into the rims of a bow, which were given to him by the angel Moroni. This scenario is believed by many people who have faith in the divinity of the Book of Mormon. There are two main sources of evidence for this scenario, and they are the two eyewitnesses of the actual translation process, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. We all have their public first-hand accounts, which they each published during their lifetimes, of how the translation occurred. First, Joseph Smith's account. There are 4 records Joseph published in his lifetime that I found in which he describes how the Book of Mormon was written. The earliest is from his own journal, in an entry in 1835, of which we have a photo courtesy of the Joseph Smith Papers Project. In it, he recounts that the angel of Moroni told him, quote, that the Urim and Thummim was hid up with the record, the Book of Mormon, and that God would give me power to translate it with the assistance of this instrument. Here Joseph directly contradicts the LDS Church idea that he used a dark rock he found somewhere in the ground. The second description from Joseph Smith is from Joseph Smith History, Volume 1. It was recorded in 1838 and published in 1842. In it, Joseph said, "A messenger sent from the presence of God to me said that there were 2 stones in silver bows, and these stones, fastened to a breastplate, constituted what is called the Urim and Thummim, and they were deposited with the plates, and the possession and use of these stones were what constituted seers in ancient and former times, and that God had prepared them for the purpose of translating this book. And again, he, the angel Moroni, told me that when I got those plates of which he had spoken, I should not show them to any person, neither the breastplate with them or the Urim and Thummim, only to those to whom I should be commanded to show them. If I did, I should be destroyed." This testimony describes the 2 interpreter stones, again, that they were given to him by the angel, and how they were fastened into a bow connected to a breastplate instead of stuck in a hat. Joseph's statement here also indicates why there might be so much confusion later about how the Book of Mormon was translated, in that he was commanded to not show the plates or the means of translation to anyone, not even to Emma or David Whitmer. The third published account from Joseph Smith is recorded in the Elder's Journal in the Joseph Smith Papers Project from July 1838. Joseph wrote a number of common questions he received about his experience and his answers. In it, he said, "Question 4th. How and where did you obtain the Book of Mormon?" Answer: Moroni, the person who deposited the plates from whence the Book of Mormon was translated, in a hill in Manchester, Ontario County, New York, being dead, and raised again therefrom, appeared unto me, and told me where they were, and gave me directions how to obtain them. I obtained them, and the Urim and Thummim with them, by means of which I translated the plates, and thus came the Book of Mormon. And the final published account I could find from Joseph Smith comes from the Wentworth Letter, written in 1839 and published in 1842 in the Times and Seasons. In it, Joseph said, "With the records was found a curious instrument which the ancients called Urim and Thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. Through the medium of the Urim and Thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God." This is about as clear a description as anyone can ask for. He used 2 transparent stones, not a dark stone, and they were set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate, not stuck in a hat. And finally, that he translated the record, not that he revealed the Book of Mormon while not even looking at the plates. In each of these 4 accounts of the translation, all written and published openly during his lifetime, Joseph Smith is consistent in declaring, first, that the Book of Mormon was given to him from God by way of an angel. Second, that it was translated by using 2 clear interpreter stones, later called the Urim and Thummim, that were also given to him specifically by that angel. And third, that those stones were fastened into the rims of a bow and connected to a breastplate. Nowhere did Joseph ever mention using a hat, a seer stone, a peep stone, or anything not given to him by the angel in the translation of the Book of Mormon. There's no room for error or confusion in his own words. Oliver Cowdery, the other eyewitness to the Book of Mormon translation, and the person who wrote all but a few of the manuscript pages as Joseph dictated them, also consistently and explicitly described how the translation took place. There are at least 3 sources from him. two published during his lifetime that give his version of events. The first is from an 1831 non-Mormon publication covering a trial where, quote, Oliver Cowdery testified under oath that Joseph Smith found with the plates from which he translated his book two transparent stones resembling glass set in silver bows, that by looking through these he was able to read in English the Reformed Egyptian characters which were engraven on the plates. Notice it mentions two clear stones resembling glass. Again, nothing like the muddy brown seer stone the church now claims Joseph used. Interestingly, this published account from Oliver's sworn statement is included at the very end of the LDS Gospel Topics essay on the subject, but President Nelson doesn't mention it anywhere in his own version of the translation. I find that omission to be fascinating, part of a long-standing pattern of omissions. Oliver's next testimony is from 1834, when he wrote in a letter to W. W. Phelps describing the translation. He said, "These were days never to be forgotten, to sit under the sound of a voice dictated by the inspiration of heaven, awakened to the utmost gratitude of this bosom. Day after day I continued, uninterrupted, to write from his mouth, as he translated with the Urim and Thummim, or as the Nephites would have said, the interpreters, the history or record called the Book of Mormon." This reference to the Nephite interpreters is key. The Book of Mormon describes them in several places as stones given by the Lord, set in rims of a bow, through which a true seer can look to translate ancient records. And Oliver's last testimony was one he gave a little over a year before he died, when he spoke to a group of saints at Council Bluffs, Iowa, in 1848. There he said, "I wrote with my own pen the entire Book of Mormon, save a few pages only, as it fell from the lips of the prophet Joseph Smith, as he translated it by the gift and power of God, by the means of the Urim and Thummim, or as it was called by that book, Holy Interpreters. I beheld with my eyes and handled with my hands the gold plates from which it was translated. I also beheld the interpreters. That book is true. Sidney Rigdon did not write it. Mr. Solomon Spaulding did not write it. I wrote it myself as it fell from the lips of the prophet." So Joseph and Oliver Cowdery both publicly and consistently described on numerous occasions how the Book of Mormon was translated. They were the two eyewitnesses to the entire translation process, the two people who would know how it was translated, if anyone knew. And in every case, they support each other in stating that the Book of Mormon was translated by the gift and power of God, from the golden plates, by means of looking through the two clear interpreter stones that were set in silver bows that had been given to Joseph by an angel. They leave no room for misinterpretation, unless they were both publicly lying until their dying days. Fourth, the ghostwriter scenario. This is the last likely scenario that I can think of for how the Book of Mormon could have possibly been written. It's not a scenario really mentioned by any modern person that I can find. To me, however, it is the only other possible explanation for the existence of this book. Each of the previous three scenarios involve Joseph dictating the Book of Mormon on the fly while a scribe writes down his words. But in this scenario, I propose that an extremely experienced religious scholar and writer, or group of writers, worked for years to conceptualize, draft, edit, and then finish the book. The reason why I think it would have taken an expert or a group of experts is because writing a book of that length is a huge challenge. Most professional writers spend many months, if not years, planning, drafting, editing their manuscripts before they are even ready for print. And such authors are almost always people educated and experienced in the world of writing and editing, not uneducated first-time writers just beginning to master basic spelling and punctuation. To add to that, the Book of Mormon is not just any book. It's unlike any other book I've ever seen or read in complexity, cohesion, and theological originality. It isn't just another John Grisham or Stephen King novel. It breaks every rule of plot and structure, but with brilliant success. The Book of Mormon is bold, unorthodox, and richly complex. Every time I read it, I'm amazed by the many themes threaded seamlessly through the book, at the intricate wordplay, the consistent tone, and most important, the moral uniformity. In its own way, it is both a blueprint for Christ's true church and also a map for the coming events of the last days. It gives examples of how a group of people can live Christ's gospel, and it gives specific and revolutionary interpretations of ancient prophecies. To think that the Book of Mormon could have been concocted as a fraud by a young 20-something, almost illiterate Joseph Smith, even with the help of a young 20-something Oliver Cowdery, is beyond my capacity of belief. And so, other than some form of translation using a stone or stones, I think the only other explanation for the Book of Mormon's creation is that a religious scholar or a group of scholars painstakingly wrote the book and then convinced Joseph, Emma, Oliver, the Whitmers, the rest of the 3 and the 8 witnesses, all to join them in a giant scheme of acting out the translation process and publishing the Book of Mormon without anyone ever finding out who the real writers were. What a feat that would have been. So, these are the 4 possible ways I can think of for how the Book of Mormon came into existence. Now I'd like to go through each one of these scenarios and look at their possible drawbacks. Are they believable in a larger context? What might be the motives of their proponents? And which one makes the most sense? First, let's look at President Nelson's option, that the Book of Mormon was revealed to Joseph Smith while he looked at a rock or rocks in the hat. The main problem I see with this idea is that he ignores the first-hand accounts of those who actually translated the book in order to rely on second-hand and post-dated accounts that were given decades after the 2 eyewitnesses were dead. In short, he basically calls Joseph and Oliver liars. In this way, President Nelson treats Joseph the same way he also treats him on the issue of polygamy. He ignores Joseph Smith's own published words and teachings in favor of much later, contrary statements made by his opponents or others who only spoke up after Joseph Smith's death. This is a very interesting pattern of Nelson's in his treatment of Joseph Smith. So why is President Nelson now pushing this contrary rock-in-the-hat narrative instead of believing in Joseph and Oliver? The point can be made that whether Joseph used a rock and hat or 2 seer stones given to him by an angel, just producing the Book of Mormon through either method is an incredible miracle. So why does he suddenly and deliberately choose the rock and the hat scenario? I can think of 3 motives he might have. First, maybe he genuinely doesn't believe in Joseph Smith. In this internet age, many people don't believe in Joseph. And so even though Joseph is the only prophet in this dispensation who has talked to an angel face to face, who translated scripture, and who gave his life for the work, President Nelson doesn't appear to trust a single word he said. Second motive, maybe President Nelson is trying to curry favor with the many vocal opponents of the church, like Jeremy Runnels of the CES Letter, in order to try and become relevant and popular with the critics. Perhaps he thinks that if he gives them what they want on this issue, they'll be nicer to him in his current administration. Who knows? And his final motive, I think maybe there is something deeper here. Perhaps President Nelson's deliberate choice to disbelieve Joseph's own words and throw him under the bus to the critics is part of a larger pattern. Let me illustrate. I want to point out several new things I've noticed happening since President Nelson took office. Things that seem to be part of a concerted effort to undermine previous prophets, leaders, and even scriptures in order to establish his own dominance. For example, number 1, Nelson has caused the angel Moroni to begin going missing from atop the LDS temples. As the Salt Lake Tribune wrote in 2020, observers have noted that the escalating Moroni-less temple trend coincides with the leadership of President Russell M. Nelson. Is there something about the angel Moroni giving the plates and interpreters to Joseph that President Nelson is offended by? Is it part of a pattern of relegating the Book of Mormon to the back shelf? Number 2, Nelson has single-handedly banned the use of the title Mormon for the church or its members, a pet peeve he's clearly held on to for decades. Most of us remember the video created by Infinite Exodus illustrating Nelson's backhanded denunciation of President Hinckley and the term Mormon in his conference address.
Today, I feel compelled to discuss with you a matter of great importance. Some weeks ago, I released a statement regarding a course correction for the name of the church.
Many of our people are disturbed by the practice of the media and of many others to disregard totally the true name of the church and to use the nickname the Mormon Church. They could do worse.
And some said it couldn't be done, so why even try?
More than 50 years ago, when I was a missionary in England, I said to one of my associates, "How can we get people, including our own members, to speak of the church by its proper name?" He replied, "You can't. The word Mormon is too deeply ingrained and too easy to say." He went on, "I've quit trying."
Let me explain why we care so deeply about this issue. And it is not inconsequential.
I am not ashamed of the nickname Mormon. Look, he went on to say, if there is any name that is totally honorable in its derivation, it is the name Mormon. And so when someone asks me about it and what it means, I quietly say, Mormon means more good.
Instead, it is a correction. It is the command of the Lord.
And so while I sometimes regret that people do not call this church by its proper name, I am happy that the nickname they use is one of great honor, made so by a remarkable man in a book which gives an unmatched testimony concerning the Redeemer of the world. Anyone who reads this precious trove of history, which was assembled and preserved in large measure by him, will come to know that Mormon is not a word of disrepute, but that it represents the greatest good, that good which is of God. It was the modern translator of this ancient record who declared that through reading it a man would come closer to God than through the reading of any other book. All of this places upon us of this church and this generation an incumbent and demanding responsibility to recognize that as we are spoken of as Mormons, we must so live that our example will enhance the perception that Mormon can mean in a very real way more good.
The name of the church is not negotiable. And if we allow nicknames to be used or adopt or even sponsor those nicknames ourselves,
I am not ashamed of the nickname Mormon.
he is offended. When it comes to nicknames of the church,
The Mormons, the Mormon Church, and so forth.
to remove the Lord's name from the Lord's church is a major victory for Satan. Christ.
I testify that the Book of Mormon is the Word of God, and that when people speak of us by the name of this book, they will compliment us if we will live worthy of the name, remembering that in a very real sense, Mormonism must mean that greater good which the Lord Jesus Christ exemplified.
And the Nelson administration's increasing drumbeat for the current LDS doctrine that, quote, the living prophet is more important to us than a dead prophet. They've included it on the church website, in correlated church material, and in the correlation-approved talk given just this April by Elder Haney, where he reiterated,
So the key is to follow the living prophet. Brothers and sisters, unlike vintage comic books and classic cars, prophetic teachings do not become more valuable with age. That is why we should not seek to use the words of past prophets to dismiss the teachings of living prophets.
By fully jumping on board the Rock in the Hat bandwagon, Nelson does the exact opposite of what Elder Haney warned us of. President Nelson seeks to use the words of the living prophet, himself, to dismiss the clear testimony of a former prophet, Joseph Smith. In fact, doing this, Nelson gets a twofer. In one act, he both diminishes Joseph Smith and lifts himself above not only Joseph, but above every single prophet of the Book of Mormon, including Moroni and even Jesus Christ himself. When I consider what President Nelson's doing here, I have to ask myself, could his ultimate goal in all of this to be to reestablish a powerful Brigham Young-like autocracy with complete authority over the church centered at the top and with himself firmly in control of its massive wealth and its millions of members, just like old times? From his pattern of action since taking over the leadership of the church, this seems like it could be a clear possibility. And that fact is at least a little troubling to me. Okay, what about the CES scenario, which says that not only did Joseph dictate the entire Book of Mormon from a rock with his face stuck in a hat, but that the whole time he was just faking it and babbling out his own fictitious book? What are some of the issues I see with this option? Well, first, just like Nelson, Jeremy Runnels deliberately ignores the two eyewitnesses, Joseph and Oliver, in order to rely on second-hand accounts given over 50 years after the translation. This doesn't feel intellectually honest to me. It feels like cherry-picking just to make a point. Second, a goal of the CES letter is to show that the Book of Mormon is a fraud. However, Jeremy Runnell's star witnesses, Emma and David Whitmer, both testified their whole lives of the authenticity and truthfulness of that very Book of Mormon. If Jeremy is so insistent on believing Emma and David, why does he not also believe them when they say the Book of Mormon is true? Just more cherry picking. To me, it undermines his credibility. Third, if Joseph Smith really did fraudulently invent the Book of Mormon by dictating it with his face in a hat, why does the very book he invented with that hat teach that a seer uses 2 stones which were fastened into the 2 rims of a bow? That makes no sense at all. Logically, if Joseph invented the whole thing, he would have written into the Book of Mormon that a seer uses a rock in the hat instead. That's pretty basic logic. And finally, by Jeremy Runnell saying that Joseph Smith falsely dictated the entire Book of Mormon in real time with his face was buried in a hat, does he even realize what he's saying? Anyone who has ever written a book knows that writing is a very difficult, complex process. If Joseph was simply able to bury his face in a hat and speak out the words to this very intricate book in one go, with no planning, no notes, no editing, no revision, that very act would be almost more miraculous than claiming to receive power from God to translate. It would be an absolute miracle. I would challenge anybody to try it. Anybody who wants to have faith in the CES letter, do this experiment. Go get a hat, get someone to scribe for you, and sit there and dictate a book that compares with the Book of Mormon in one go. Let me know in the comments how that goes. Or let's make it even easier. Go read Jacob 5, the allegory of the olive tree, as many times as you need to. Then grab your hat and dictate it back to someone word for word while they write it down. Trust me, you won't be able to do it. For just this reason alone, when I stop to think about the CES Letter Theory, I start to realize just how ridiculous this claim really is. So what would be the motives of people such as Runnels and other prominent anti-Mormons who join with President Nelson in this ridiculous rock in the hat theory? Why do they stick to such an unbelievable theory in the face of the limitations of reality? I personally don't know, but I have a couple of ideas. First, they feel great pain at being betrayed by a church they put their lives and their hearts into, and they want to educate and protect others. I can definitely understand this motive. Second, maybe they realize the Book of Mormon could be true, but they don't want to admit it to themselves or to others, and so they lump it in with the many other lies and deceptions of the LDS Church. In other words, they paint the Book of Mormon as guilty by association, claiming that there are so many real problems with the LDS Church. This book must be wrong too. And I admit, that's a logical step. Or third, maybe some of the antis fall into the trap many of us do, the trap of wanting to be the smartest guy in the room. Coming up with a cool alternative theory for the translation sounds a lot smarter than simply believing in Joseph and Oliver. Or finally, there could be a money motive. The reality is, being a successful anti-Mormon influencer is big business these days. With enough of a following, you can become financially set for life, with your nice house on the hill and a 401k, just like all the LDS general authorities have. And that's a big motive for anyone. Next, how about the ghostwriter scenario? That the Book of Mormon was actually written by an anonymous expert writer or a group of writers who then gave the book to Joseph Smith, staged the entire translation process, and then let him run with it. What are the issues and drawbacks I see with this option? Well, first, it requires a very coordinated cover-up. Joseph and his parents' family, Emma, Oliver, all 3 of the Whitners, the 3 and the 8 witnesses, everyone would have had to not only be in on it, but they could never spill the beans as long as they lived. When I consider the fact that the 3 original witnesses to the plates, Oliver, David, and Martin Harris, all left the church, why would they have continued to keep such a secret? Instead, the opposite happened. Each of those men stayed true to their testimony of the miracle of the Book of Mormon to their dying days, even after breaking off with Joseph Smith. And that's a big deal to me. Second, the ghostwriter scenario presupposes a writer or writers who had a deep love for God, for truth, and for the entire human family. The pages of the Book of Mormon are full of those values. Knowing that if I were a ghostwriter of this amazing book, After it was published, I would have to watch the church go the opposite way of the book's true message and self-destruct, dragging the book down with it. I wouldn't have been able to sit in secrecy as the true writer without coming out and reclaiming the book and telling how it was really made. It'd be like watching your beloved child wander out into the street and get hit by a car while doing nothing to stop it. There's just no way I could do that. And what would have been the ghostwriter's motives? It couldn't have been money, power, or fame? No. If so, why didn't they ever come forward to receive them? Could it have been to see a new, true church established? But if so, why didn't they come forward when the LDS Church went so far off the rails from everything the Book of Mormon teaches and shows about how Christ's church should be? So none of these motives make sense to me. And so, while the ghostwriter scenario is the only other option I can imagine being possible, it still isn't plausible. And so that leaves me with the Joseph Smith scenario. Is it plausible to believe that Joseph and Oliver were simply telling the truth the whole time, and that the Book of Mormon was indeed translated from an ancient scripture written on golden plates given to them by an angel, while using 2 clear interpreter stones fastened into the rims of a bow? What are the drawbacks and the issues I see with this? Well, there's several. First, for those who believe this scenario, they go directly against President Nelson, the sustained president of the church today. Going against the prophet is no small matter, as I have learned personally. Having a different opinion than Nelson's is not tolerated by the church. And so to believe Joseph and Oliver were telling the truth puts your membership in the church in direct jeopardy. Second, believing Joseph and Oliver means questioning the late accounts of Emma and David Whitmer, 2 people that I admire greatly. How could they have told a story so different from the one published by Joseph and Oliver? That's confusing. There are a couple of possible motives, including David's feeling of betrayal at being excommunicated by Joseph, and Emma's desire to help her son in discrediting the 1870s Brighamite Church. But they still leave a lot of questions unanswered. Third, believing Joseph means believing God chose him to do this work, and Oliver with him, in spite of a lot of apparent problems Joseph may have been involved in later, once the church was formed and running. Why would God pick a flawed person like Joseph for his work instead of picking someone more perfect? Fourth, while Oliver left the church pretty early on and stayed true to the Book of Mormon, could Joseph himself had an ulterior motive? He went on to gain wealth, power, popularity, titles, glory, everything the Book of Mormon teaches us against. Could those motives have been powerful enough to cause Joseph to invent the Book of Mormon out of thin air? And finally, fifth, believing Joseph and Oliver requires believing in miracles, that God can call seers in modern times and give them his power to translate ancient records. Admittedly, that takes a lot of faith. So those are my only 4 viable scenarios I can see to explain the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. Each option of these requires a lot of faith to believe, or even to disbelieve. And at this point, so far removed from 1828, it's impossible for any of us to know for sure exactly what really happened. Looking at all the evidences in front of me, I choose to believe in Joseph and Oliver. I have the Book of Mormon in my hands. It's tangible, it's real, and it appears marvelous to me. It's an exercise of faith to believe in it, I know, but an exercise that I choose to do. If someday the Lord teaches me exactly what happened back in those cabins in New England, then I'll know for sure. But until then, I continue to study and be amazed by the Book of Mormon every day, and by Jesus Christ's gospel that it teaches me.